Kennedy Ryan is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling romance author whose latest novel, Can't Get Enough, is the third installment of her very popular Skyland trilogy series, which is now in development for television at Peacock. Her work has been featured on Today, Glamour, it's been in Cosmo and Ebony and Time, on NPR and Entertainment Weekly, all kinds of places. It's celebrated for the way that it centers real people with real life struggles right in the middle of compelling love stories. Why does Kennedy write? And why does she write like this? This is what she and I talk about. Here I am with Kennedy Ryan. Thank you for being here and congratulations on all of your successes. You've had so many. Yay. Yay for
Thank you
you.
for having me. I'm really excited to chat. Thanks for having me.
So I find the way that you approach love stories
Mhm.
really interesting because you locate your characters like right in the middle of where they are. Sometimes they are battling depression,
Mhm.
sometimes they are battling death. And notwithstanding, like sort of kind of living through really dark moments in life, you center these characters in a place where they still experience and explore and engage with and take the risk of a love story. Why was it important for you to center love stories in that context?
And maybe it has something to do with my own love story. you
Oh,
know,
I want to know. Tell us. I want to know all about it.
I have been married for 26 years, 27 coming up in a few days. And he's my best friend,
Mm.
but we've been through a lot. And I honestly believe that love shines brightest when it's tested. I believe that loving someone, even in difficult circumstances, is like a crucible. I compare it to a crucible. You know how you have like you were back in high school and you had those like white dishes and you in chemistry and you would put stuff in there and you would set it on fire. And the only thing that's left is like what's real and what's pure. That's kind of how I think about love. And I definitely think about my love stories that way. It's not about suffering. It's not about going through a hard time. It's about real life happening. And I think sometimes people think of romance as something that's fluffy, something that's light, and the genre has that to offer. I really enjoy writing love stories that are grounded in real life, that are grounded in real circumstances, that are grounded in challenges and circumstances that people will recognize. So I will write about a woman with lupus, who is finding love. I will write about a woman who is coming out of a deep depression, like through therapy, through medication, the way we pull ourselves up and out of those difficult circumstances. And in the process, healing and preparing herself for love. So my favorite thing about my brand is what I call
Mm.
seenness, meaning that when a woman or a man is reading my stories, there are some of them who are going to see themselves in a way that maybe they haven't in fiction before, especially when you're talking about marginalized people. When you're talking about Black people, brown people, queer people, disabled people, fat people who have sometimes been relegated to the margins of narratives and culture. I put them in the center, and in the center of whatever's going on in their lives. It'll look a lot like whatever's going on in a lot of the lives of people who are reading the books.
Well, I think that what's so powerful about that, Kennedy, is that, and you just said it, it's not just a
Mhm.
story about when in your
Mhm.
life you might find love, which might be in the middle of some really painful circumstance, but you really focus and you highlight like who is lovable, who is
Yes.
attractive, who is
Yes.
sexy.
Mhm.
And there are so many messages, I think, that sort of confine that notion of lovability,
Mhm.
sexiness, attractiveness to,
Mhm.
one or a few segments of the population, but
Yes.
you really expand it. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about that because it's not just about where you are when you find love, it's about
Mhm.
whether or not you see yourself as lovable. And
Yes.
that also seems to me to really be a key part of your writing. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have always I'm a lifelong reader, a voracious reader. When I was growing up, I'm one of the stereotypical kid under the blanket with the flashlight, because before
Nerd.
I know before we had phones that
Hashtag
lit
black
up,
nerd.
blurred, before we could read on our phones and it would light up, I'm the kid long time ago under the blanket with a paperback and a flashlight, so I've always been a voracious reader. And a lot of times I was fortunate in that there were stories written by people like B.B. Moore Campbell, and Toni Morrison. But there weren't as many, not that they didn't exist, there weren't as many romances written by Black women that centered Black women. Not that they didn't exist at all, but I grew up in the country and I grew up in rural North Carolina, and we had one library in our town, and it didn't have a wide selection of books. And there weren't a lot of romances that centered Black women, brown women, written by Black women, brown women. And so I had to do a lot of what we call now self-inserting,
Mm.
where it's like I see the blonde hair and the blue eyes, and I kind of like substitute myself, and I did that growing up. And a lot of people still do that because maybe they don't realize that we've expanded a lot now. And you can read a story written by someone like me or a lot of other women who are writing vital stories right now, and you will actually see Black women, brown women. And so often, in the context that we're living in, and that we've grown up in, a lot of cultural messages communicate to us that maybe the person who looks like you, who might be Black, brown, fat, queer, disabled, whatever it is, doesn't get the love story or isn't worthy of it. They may not say it explicitly, but when you look at magazines, when you read stories, when you watch television, you watch movies, you don't see it as much. You don't see people who look like you or people who are coming for where you're coming from centered in a way that says you are beautiful and you deserve joy. And especially for me as a Black woman, so often the message that comes to us, even if it's not explicit, is that we don't deserve joy, that our outcomes are not as good. Struggle, that it's
And
going
we're
to be
always
hard,
sad, struggling, and
struggling,
in
hard.
despair.
Right. And I think, and also there's this myth, we talk so often about the myth of the strong Black woman. It's not that we're not strong, it's that we shouldn't always have to be. And it's that we should not always have to be, and also that these systems that we're growing up in and that we're navigating should acknowledge our pain. And a lot of times they don't acknowledge our pain, they don't acknowledge our suffering, but they also don't acknowledge our joy. And when I'm writing a love story, I always say that I first, if it's a man and a woman, I'm first building that woman who is incredible, who's strong, but is also vulnerable and fully human. She's dimensional, not just one thing. And then I'm gonna build a character, a partner who is worthy of her, a partner who deserves her, who is gonna respect her and love her outrageously.
Well, and I think that more broadly speaking, isn't it also about relatability? Because,
Hmm.
you're a lifelong reader, which
Yeah.
means that you, like me, like grew up
Hmm.
reading stories about all kinds of people. And
Yeah.
even if they
Yeah.
didn't look like me, I would
Yeah.
still find elements of the story that were relatable. I would still like be in awe of an
Yes.
author. If you look at what you do, the way that you're
Mhm.
telling these stories, you are centering stories that haven't been told before, but
Mhm.
the what they live and experience and
Mhm.
the way they find love is something that you don't have to
Right.
be Black to get
No,
it. You
no,
don't have
no,
to be
absolutely.
suffering from, deep
Right.
mental illness
Yes.
to get it, right? I mean, you've
Right.
managed that sort of universality too. Tell me how
Yes.
you did that. How do you
Yeah,
do
and
that?
what you just said is the key, like that word universality. That's something that I take into every story. There are a few things I take into every story that I'm writing. I am writing usually from a place that's very specific. meaning I'm crafting a character who is from a specific community, has maybe a specific background, whatever it is, but there is specificity to that character and to even the community they're from, whatever that is. Everybody experiences joy. We hope at some point in life everyone experiences love, everyone experiences despair, loss, grief. Like there are these universal experiences that are part of being human.
Mm.
And that is kind of that balance, is the specificity of maybe I'm someone who hasn't seen myself in cultural narrative as enough before, and at the same time there's something that anybody who walks into that story could glean from. And that's kind of that balance of specificity and universality. And for me, a lot of times we are measuring success in, do you make lists, the New York Times list, which, I've done that, books being made into TV, all of those things have
Yay.
happened, have happened and are happening for me. So I'm not going to pretend that those things are not important, but I have stopped measuring those things as like using those things as my first measure of success. And for me now, my first measure of success is impact.
Mm.
And when I'm talking about impact, it is how did something I write connect with a reader? And it's the relatability. It is them feeling seen. It is finding yourself in a story. It is an action step. It could even be, you were talking about the Skyland series. When I released the first book of that series before I let go, it's a divorced couple, and they've suffered some losses, and their marriage didn't survive those losses. And she ends up in a very deep depression. And when we meet her, she's coming out of that. She's been to therapy. She is in therapy. She is now like taking antidepressants. Like she's pulling herself out of that. And it's and then the man, her husband, who was resistant to therapy over the course of this book. And we know therapy has its own stigma. And then when you get to men, there's even, a deeper
Oh, I
stigma.
thought they loved it. I thought
Oh,
that
they
like guys
love
they
it.
love, especially they
They
love couples
love it.
therapy. They love
Yes,
men love therapy of all sorts. I thought
of
that was
all
in the man
sorts.
handbook.
Exactly. And I mean, that's really one of the things I wanted to write into, was to model for women out there who might be like, come on, you need therapy. Come with me to therapy. Let's heal. Let's grow. Seeing a character in this ex-husband who over time is at first disparaging of therapy. And over the course of the novel gets into therapy and starts to understand this is healing. This is helping. This is preparing me to reunite with my wife. And if it wasn't for this process that we've both gone through, we wouldn't be ready for each other. And I mentioned that because after that book came out, my DMs, emails, messages flooded with people who were like, I called my insurance company today to see if they would cover it, if they would cover therapy. I, went back, I started taking my antidepressant. We called a couples therapist. For me, though, that's a measure of impact. Do you know when something that I hoped would happen because of something I was writing is happening for readers when they're reading those stories? That connection, that for me is the first measure of success.
Well, sometimes, especially when you're talking about something that's as personal and traumatic as
Yes.
death, uh,
Mm-hmm.
your response to death, as you talked about,
Mm-hmm.
no spoilers, but
No
your,
spoilers.
your, your, we'll just say that some books in your series um, engage that issue.
Mm-hmm.
People don't often feel comfortable
Yes.
expressing a thing, showing their feelings about something until they see
Mm-hmm.
it somewhere else. And we
Right.
were talking about representation in the context of
Mm-hmm.
demographics, right? Like
Yeah.
often women who look a certain way or
Yeah.
who aren't, blonde, blue eyed, there's been a vision of beauty that hasn't
Mm-hmm.
always been celebrated. I definitely
Mm-hmm.
think that's changing. But
Mm-hmm.
to the point you just made, there's also a vision of humanity that I think
Yeah.
people don't, people aren't always comfortable being open about being
For
sad
sure. Yes.
or not feeling good. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's universal. I don't think
Yes.
it's just men, but I,
Right.
I do think that, just throwing it out there, not a therapist, I think that men are not supported or encouraged to talk about
Right. Right.
sadness and depression in the way, like those spaces don't exist for them necessarily in the way that they do for women, which really brings
Right.
me to the next thing I wanted to talk about with you because I read you wrote 3 books during the pandemic.
I did.
Okay. Like
Woo!
people were not like the rest of us were like washing our grocery bags and you were doing all
Oh,
that stuff too. But
yeah.
I read this, I was like, she's living through all of the pandemic horror that the rest of us did. And you wrote 3 books.
Yeah.
And I'll let you talk about this to the extent that you're comfortable. You
Mhm.
were managing and grappling with your own stuff as
Oh,
you were
for
being
sure.
a partner and a
Yeah.
mother and a writer. How did you, or how, I'm just saying, how did you get all those books done during such a hard time? And how did you get them done when you yourself were managing your own really difficult time?
It was very difficult. I mean, the pandemic was hard on us all. You know, you mentioned my son. My son's autistic and needs a lot of structure, has therapy, has, a certain classroom setting that he needs and that he thrives in. And all of a sudden, all of that was gone, And actually, we were in the middle of we moved during the pandemic. We didn't realize we were moving during the pandemic. We lived in Atlanta for a long time and we had moved back to North Carolina briefly. And then we were moving back to Atlanta. And it's people started talking about this pandemic thing. And we moved back to Atlanta. And you may not be familiar with Spaghetti Junction. People who are familiar with Atlanta will know it is like this web of roads, and it looks like spaghetti. And when we drove into the city of Atlanta, there were no cars at all. And we were like, what is going on? We didn't realize the mayor had shut the city down the day we moved there. And so the school that I had set up for my son, all the therapies that we had, everything that I had spent really months preparing, we had gone ahead and visited schools and investigated therapists, all of that just collapsed in a day. And he really needs all of that. So the pandemic was hard on everyone, especially on disabled kids, especially on special needs families, and everyone. But we began to feel the effects of that very, very quickly. So I did have a deadline. I did write 3 books during the pandemic. The third book I was writing was Before I Let Go, which is the book we were just talking about, the first book of the Skyland series. I do not recommend writing a book about a character who is in depression when you are in depression. you know,
I was going to
I,
ask you about that. Like, was it
yeah.
therapeutic or did it feel
Eventually,
painful? Yeah.
it was, yes, all of those. I did not realize that I had depression. I thought I had writer's block. Because I was like, okay, I wrote a book, I wrote another book. It was really, really hard. And when I wrote that second book, I just kind of sensed, I don't know when I'm going to get to write again because I really don't have it. And so I had a deadline for this third book, and I realized I can't write. And so I started talking to a writing coach, and I was like, hey, I can't write. I need you to fix me so that I can meet my deadline. And so we started talking, and she was like, Kennedy, I actually think this is something a little more, and this was her word, a little more insidious, than just writer's block. And I was like, what do you think it is? And she's like, I think you need to talk to someone. Maybe it might be depression. And I'm like, oh, no, 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 you don't understand. I don't do depression. Like, I've got to go. I'm that girl who's constantly in motion, who's got all the things to do. I don't have time for that. And eventually I did make my way into therapy. And in the book, my character Yasmin goes through like 3 therapists before she finds the right one, which is what my experience was. And I put that there because so many people who are just starting like a journey to look for therapy, sometimes it takes a try or two, and it can be really discouraging when you're already suffering, when you're already hurting, that you finally get to the therapist and then it's like, oh, this is not right. Okay, try another one. Oh gosh, it took everything. I couldn't even get out of bed. I couldn't even shower. And you want me to try this again? So when I found the right therapist, I was diagnosed with depression. I grew up in a family that was in the church. Love my family, but when you grow up in that space, a lot of it is like, just pray it away.
I was just going to
Just
say, I grew up in that space.
yes.
Like my parents, and God bless them, Therapy would not have been
Yes.
on their go-to list.
Yes. And so, I'd never been on medication for anything like that. And it was something I didn't even realize it was a barrier until I had to negotiate it. And it was so funny because the first session I had with the therapist I actually ended up using and who I still see, 3 years later, still seeing her Saturday, thank God. um, I was like, okay, I need you just to figure this out because I need to write my book. Like I have a deadline. We just need to fix this so that I can write my book. And she goes, I don't care about your book. And I'm like, no, I need you to care about my book. And she's like, no, I only care about you. I only care about you feeling better. I only care about you, learning how to deal with this. I think that if you just really give this a chance, it could be the best book you ever write. And that is the book that more than any book I've ever written changed my life. That's the one that's now that whole series now is being developed for television, optioned by Universal, developing at Peacock, and just changed my entire career probably one of the lowest points in my life, writing that book. And I didn't realize that the intersection of my own experience with depression was so going to deeply inform that story. And because it was so personal for me, it felt so personal for a lot of people because it was grounded in lived experience. Everybody's journey looks different, but a lot of people who were maybe suffering in silence or who were maybe hesitant about getting help saw something of themselves in that story. And for me, that's when I was like, yeah, okay, it was worth it. It was very difficult, but it was worth it.
What did what did depression look like for you?
Oh gosh, it was during the pandemic. So I thought I'm not getting out of bed. My husband was the first to notice it. He was like, do you notice that you don't get out of bed much anymore? And I was like, it's the pandemic. Nobody gets out of bed. And he's like, no, people do get out of bed. He's like, it's like you're not getting out of bed. I mean, it took everything for me to even shower. It
Mm.
looked like panic attacks. It looked like crying alone in my closet. It looked like, and people don't recognize sometimes that if you have a chemical imbalance, you will feel depression in your body. It's not just sadness, it is fatigue, it is brain fog, it is not being able to remember things, it is mood, like big mood swings, sometimes irritability. Like there's a lot that comes with depression. And I had all of that. And for me, because there was a lot of strain during the pandemic, even with what was going on with my son, with my deadlines, with our future, I remember going into my closet and having a panic attack. And really not wanting to worry my husband and wanting to keep it together for my son. And so often we as women, when we're moms, when we're wives, when we're sisters, friends, we are putting everyone ahead of us. We are making sure that everyone else is okay. And sometimes we're not taking care of ourselves. And that's what I was doing. For me, my mission during the pandemic was keep my son alive. He's autistic, he's immunocompromised. And so I was like, my only job until this is over is keep my kid alive. Oh yeah, and I have to write these books.
I have these deadlines too,
I
but
have these deadlines. Yeah,
second
yeah.
order of priority. So,
Mhm.
how did you get out of it, or how did you get past that moment where you were still able to create, which you did?
Yeah, I did. I mean, first of all, the book was very late, and I will give my editor credit for being very human. I was very fortunate that I had an editor who was like, Kennedy, like, put yourself first. Like, you're the most important thing. We wanted to release it at this point. We'll release it later. Just get better. And I was very fortunate to have that space. I remember I mentioned my parents, well, growing up in a household of faith. My mom has this sixth sense. She just has this classic mother's intuition about when I need her, about when something's going on. And I remember being in my closet and feeling like I was really, really at the bottom. And my mom called and I was like, hi, I'm just faking it, trying to project that I'm okay. And she said something that triggered me. And she didn't realize that it was a trigger for me, but it was something about my son's future. And during the pandemic, that was really a difficult subject for me. And we started talking about it, and I tried to continue in the conversation without letting her know. And then my breath started shortening, and then I started going into a panic attack while we were on the phone. And my
Mm.
mom was like, what is going on? And I'm like, I can't even catch my breath. I can't even speak. And she said, I'm coming. She was in North Carolina. I was in Atlanta. She goes, I'm coming. And the next day she was there. She
Mothers.
flew. She flew during a pandemic. Oh gosh, I don't want to get emotional. But she flew like the next day. She was at our house. She was folding clothes. She was cooking meals. She was taking care of my son. She was like, you go off and write your book, do whatever you have to do. And my husband was the one who was like, I think we need to move. We need to move back home. I think we need to.
Mm.
We had not been around our family in 20 years. We lived far away, and we sold our house in like a month, and we packed up everything and we moved to North Carolina. We had to live with my parents because our house was being built. We had to live with my parents. Like during the pandemic, it slowed everything down. We were supposed to be in that house in 3 months. We lived with my parents for a year.
Wow.
Adult people.
It's one
Uh,
thing when like mom has a second sense. It's another thing when she's like in the room next door.
I
Right?
literally was a grown woman writing my book, trying to, my son was in my sister's childhood bedroom. My husband and I were in my childhood bedroom, and my parents were downstairs. And it was like, how did I get here? Do you know what I mean? I'm like, how did this happen? And it was it took a lot of getting used to. I felt like, why is my life doing this? But I didn't realize it was exactly what I needed. It was a safe space for me to heal. I continued my therapy sessions. I took my medications. I wrote my book, and it was a transformative time. And all while my parents were there, helping with my son, making sure that we had dinner that I didn't have to think about. It's small things, but it was really big for me at that point in my life.
When I think about the fact that you are somebody who went from not being able to get out of bed,
Hmm.
and then you're the subject of a bidding war, which if you are creative in any kind of way, those are magic words, bidding war.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, what is your advice? What do you tell people who have made the decision to write? So, long question. How do you
Yeah.
sort of find your way out of a dark moment? And
Mhm.
two, if telling stories and being a storyteller is
Mhm.
something that connects with you, how do you start?
Right. Well, the first part of that question, I think getting, if you're in a dark place, getting help, and that sounds so simple, but it's not something, it's a lot of times we don't. A lot of us suffer in silence. A lot of us don't get help. So that would be the first thing I would say is get help. Take the step of sharing that burden with someone, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a friend, whether it's a partner, and making sure that you are getting the help you need, whether that is therapy, whether that is, medication, whatever it is, whether it's a support group. But not because the thing about depression, and I say this in my book and I say it all the time, depression is a liar. It morphs and warps our perceptions. It tells us things that aren't true about ourselves and about our circumstances. And when we're off on our own, like in this dark corner, it tortures us, and we start to believe it. And when you shine light on it, and what I mean by shine light on it is when you expose those lies that depression tells you, when you expose it to truth, when you expose it to knowledge and understanding, like in the context of therapy, when you expose it to love, like when depression tells you that you're too much of a burden, that your family will be better off without you, which is the kind of crazy thing that your depression will tell you. When you expose it to truth with people you love, you expose it to their love, and to them saying that that's not true. Let's find you help. Let's do what we need, And for me, faith, whatever that looks like for anybody, but for me, faith is a big part of it for me. So those are things that I would say to people who find themselves in dark circumstances and need to get out, is getting past, first of all, not telling anyone, and then getting past shame, getting past not wanting to get help or not wanting to talk about your feelings, getting past that and really connecting to some source that can help you, resource, whether it's a psychotherapist, medication support group, whatever that is. So that's that part of your compound question. And for people who want to, this is the best time, I think, in the history of mankind to be a writer, and that sounds hyperbolic, but it really isn't, because we have all these mechanisms for self-publishing. You mentioned that I started out traditionally, and I did 4 books traditionally, which was fine. I didn't have a lot of creative control. I didn't have a lot of control over branding or marketing or any of that. And I am someone who likes control. I'm an entrepreneur. I am, someone who starts things and who likes to run things. And so self-publishing was just really getting off the ground. And I was like, I want to do that. I looked around and I saw people making a great living doing it. And I tried it. And I definitely, like, you have to decide what you want your career to be like, because traditional, and this is kind of getting in the weeds, but traditional publishing and self-publishing are very different routes. I've done both, I've navigated both. I really built my career, my reputation through self-publishing. And if you do a really good job, those traditional publishers will often come to you, which is what's happening now. Like those systems, all those doors that used to be closed to you. And especially for, we were talking about different communities, especially for marginalized women, Black people only make up 5 to 7% of traditional publishing. Like, so when you look at that,
That actually feels that I'm not a naive person, but that
yeah.
number feels shockingly low to me.
It is. It is shockingly low. I mean, when you look at the whole context of publishing, we're somewhere around 5 to 7%. So more than 5 to 7% of us want to tell stories. More than 5 to 7% of us want to make a living with our gift. And so what we're seeing now is an explosion in self-publishing, an explosion in indie publishing, because if we are not invited to or given a seat at a table, we start building our own tables. And that is really what self-publishing and indie publishing do, not just for Black and brown people, but publishing overall is a very gate-kept space, and only so many are let in. And so with the revolution, and I do think it's a revolution in publishing, of indie publishing, it's so easy now. So the first thing I would say is, if you want to be a published author and no one is, there's not an opportunity, make your own opportunity. Like, there's too much information out there that's so readily available about what self-publishing is. Also, don't publish trash, because that sounds easy. That sounds easy.
Actually, I don't think it does. I think you should say that again, because I'm not sure everybody got the memo.
Yes, because I think with the ease of self-publishing, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, it's easy, so I should just do it. And a lot of people are not publishing quality books. And it gives those people who are publishing really great books a bad reputation. So for a long time, publishing at large looked down on indie publishing, right? But now indie publishing is really driving so much of the actual sales that are happening in genre fiction, especially. And so I would say, yes, you can publish your book after a month, but why not make sure that you can actually write? Why not make sure that you actually, have a good cover? Why not make sure that your book doesn't have typos, that you have a good editor? Like, actually treat this like a career. Treat it, give it the respect that it deserves. For me, I had been, I mentioned I started writing for like my little newspaper when I was 17 years old, and I went on to journalism school. I have been writing in some way in a public space or professional space for 20 years. When I figured out that I was going to write fiction, I started taking courses. I have a journalism degree. I've done ghostwriting. I've done it all. And I started taking courses before I published my first novel, because that doesn't mean it translates to fiction. And I'm like, if I really believe that I have something to say, and if I really believe that my story should matter, I should put them in the best setting possible. So don't publish trash. Make sure that you're putting your very best foot forward, whatever that looks like for you. And I mean, you never know. For me, traditional publishing came back to me and said, would you come back? And I see that happening for a lot of my friends. But some people are like, I don't want to traditionally publish. I like owning my stuff. I like making a lot of money that I don't have, and I get to keep most of the royalties. I like creating, figuring out my own covers. I like being my own boss. I think it's figuring out what you want your career to look, understanding what each of those paths entails, what the challenges are, what the limitations are, what the pros are, what the cons are, and then deciding what you want your path to look like. And this is a long answer to your compound question, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. The soul part of it that I think about is figure out your why. And what I mean by that is when I first started writing fiction, I was like, what's selling? What are people reading? I'm just going to write that. And those first books, they're fine. Like, you can tell I'm a good writer. But right around maybe the fifth book or so, I started asking myself, why? Why am I writing? Who am I writing for? What do I want my legacy to be in this genre? And it completely reshaped who I was centering. It reshaped what I was writing. I started writing for impact. I started writing from creative conviction. It reshaped what my career was. And everybody's why is going to be different. But if you take the time to figure out your why, then you can start to set your goals from there. You can start to set your path based on what you want out of it. And if you look at what someone else is getting and you let what is success for someone else define it for you, when you get it, it feels hollow because you didn't take the time to figure out, what do I want? What will make me feel like I'm doing the right thing?
Kennedy Ryan didn't just find her seat at the table. Girl, you built a table and the chairs, and then you moved it all into a conference room of your own design. One thing, because I hope everybody listened, she said, make sure you are good and you know how to write, and make sure it makes sense. And just not just as a lawyer and fact finder, but as a reader, I read once that something that was also really important to you were these accuracy readers, where you
Oh,
paid
yes,
people to
yes,
review your work
yes,
to just ensure that,
yes.
you know, the things that you are
Mhm.
communicating have
Yeah,
some actual factual resonance.
absolutely.
That doesn't mean that they are, you're not writing history, you're not doing
No.
biographies, but
Mm-mm.
your stories are located in the context of things that people can relate to. And in order to make them relatable, they have to be real. And
Yeah.
before I let you go, I have to hear from you,
Yes.
especially in this moment that we're
Yeah.
all in. How important is accuracy? We can't say
Mhm.
truth because you're a fiction writer, but
Yeah.
accuracy in
Yes.
depicting experience. How
Mhm.
important is that to you?
So important. It is honestly, and we call them sensitivity readers a lot of times. And the reason we do that is because, let's say I mentioned that one of my books, Real, features a woman who has lupus. When I wrote that book, I interviewed maybe 12 people who were either living with lupus, who were family members of people who have lupus, doctors who treat lupus. Like, that is the foundation for my creative process, is talking with people who are living those experiences. And then, of course, lots of research. Like the book that I'm writing now, I'm reading 5 memoirs for this book. I've interviewed about 15 people who
Mm.
have this lived experience or treat this lived experience or have family members or partners of this lived experience. So the process that you're talking about right now is the bedrock of my creative process. I don't start writing until I have had interviews with people who are living these experiences, read book, all of that is informing the fiction. Then the plot starts to grow out of what is real. And then on the back end of that, I often engage some of those people and I compensate them. People who I interviewed, I will say, hey, when I'm done writing this book, I would love for you to read it to make sure that I get things as right as possible. And the reason I do that is, especially when you're writing about marginalized communities, about disabled communities, about vulnerable communities, you don't want to do harm. And I talk about it as hip, and this will sound weird. I talk about it as writing hippocratically. It's first do no harm. That is for me the first rule. I can write an amazing book, and if I wrote it in a way that misrepresents or badly, when I say badly represents, not like there's not some truth in it, but it somehow warps what that experience is, or it damages that vulnerable community in my depiction, then it can be a great story, but it to me it's not good. I regret writing it because I harmed in the process. There is an integrity that we have to have as writers, or that I feel, a personal integrity that I feel as far as depicting lived experience, especially when someone out there is actually living it. When I talk about seenness, there's something about opening up a book and you see your lived experience reflected there. But there's also something about opening a book and seeing something that affects you depicted in a way that's stereotypical, that's damaging, that's painful, that's harmful. And I don't ever want to be guilty of that. And so sensitivity readers are such a huge part of my creative process. Interview is such a huge part of my process. Like being in conversation with that lived experience and listening. Like you can't just give it to them and say, read it. And when they tell you what's wrong, or when they tell you what's harmful, you don't listen, and you're like, okay, whatever. I think I got it. No, you have to listen. And when you listen and you adjust the work, that is a safety for you as a storyteller. And it's also safety for the story. We had done a cover reveal in Entertainment Weekly, and the book, this was when I was in indie, and it's a really big deal for an indie author to have a cover reveal in Entertainment Weekly. And so we were like, oh my gosh, and one of the sensitivity readers came back and was like, I think there might be a problem with this aspect of the story. And it was like, oh, I'm going to put the brakes on. We have to fix it. And my, publicist was like, no, 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 no. We've already done the cover reveal. It's coming out. And I'm like, maybe we will. But I am not going to go forward with this until I fix it. And so, I sent them everything that I had written. They read through it, like took the time to read through it, helped me, adjust whatever needed to be adjusted. And then I was like, okay, so it wasn't a big deal. We're still on course. But it was a test for me. Like when the rubber meets the road, do you really mean it when you say you don't want to harm these communities? Do you really mean it when you say you want to listen? And that you want to make sure that what you're putting out there is reflective of what people are really going through. And, for me, the benefit of writing romance is that romances, and some people will call it predictable, all romances end in a happily ever after, right? And for me, some people are like, oh, that's so predictable. For me, it's the safest genre to have difficult conversations, because even as you're navigating something that's difficult, there's guaranteed joy at the end. You know that it's going to be okay. And sometimes when people are navigating experiences that look like theirs, that are traumatic, that are painful, that were hurtful, they want that assurance. It's like, okay, I'm excavating something that's really difficult, but I know I can trust Kennedy because she's writing romance and she's going to guarantee me joy at the end.
Kennedy Ryan, you are a creator, you are a boss, and you are an inspiration. And you're also terribly kind for extending this conversation way longer
I
than it
probably
was
cut
supposed to
your
be.
ear off.
I
I'm
know.
sorry.
No, I was about to say, okay, everybody, we're going to take a break. Kennedy and I are going to go get a coffee and we'll be right back. But
Right
I'm
back.
actually, it's not like I could do like a telethon in this conversation. You are
Thank you
something
so much.
special.
Oh,
The
God.
third book in the Skyland trilogy will be out on May 13th.
Yes.
Can't get enough.
Yes.
Everybody, you can pre-order now, I am sure, but
Yes.
make sure that you check this out on May 13th. Kennedy's third in that trilogy. Can't Get Enough is the new book. Kennedy Ryan, you are a hero and a star, and thank you for being here. Really,
Thank you so
I've
much.
enjoyed this more than you know. Thank you so much.